The boardroom on the 42nd floor of Blackwood Enterprises had witnessed 3 decades of decisions worth billions, but it had never seen anything like this moment. 12 directors sat frozen around the mahogany table that cost more than most Americans earned in 2 years, their attention locked on a confrontation nobody could have predicted. Bradford Sterling's second largest shareholder, and the man who had spent 3 years positioning himself to take control of this company, stood with his face cycling through shades of red that suggested either rage or cardiac distress. His finger pointed at the corner of the room where fluorescent light met shadow, where a figure in a Navy security uniform had just spoken words that shattered the careful architecture of corporate power. Marcus Cole had spent 6 months being invisible in this building. 58 years old hair, more salt than pepper. Hands that had translated for presidents and senators now wrapped around a flashlight on his belt. He had learned to move through these executive floors like a ghost, noticed only when something needed fixing, forgotten the moment the task was complete. But ghosts do not speak, and Marcus had just broken the first rule of his existence in this tower of glass and ambition. Eleanor Blackwood sat at the head of the table, her hands frozen mid-sign, her eyes wide with something that looked almost like hope. At 76, she had built this empire from 5,000 borrowed dollars and sheer refusal to accept that deafness meant defeat. She had read lips through hostile negotiations, signed contracts that lesser men would have feared to touch, and created an $800 million testament to human will. But somewhere in the last decade, the walls had closed in. Her son Richard translated for her in meetings now, and Richard caught perhaps half of what she actually said. The board had learned to talk around her, over her, about her, while she sat right there watching their mouths move too fast to follow. Bradford's voice cut through the silence with the precision of a man accustomed to being obeyed. "Who the hell are you?" Marcus stepped forward into the light, and the contrast could not have been sharper. Bradford in his $4,000 Brioni suit cufflinks that cost more than Marcus's monthly rent, the carefully cultivated appearance of a man born to rule. Marcus in his security uniform, the fabric slightly faded from too many washes, shoes polished but clearly not new, the invisible man suddenly refusing to disappear. "I'm the person you never bothered to see." Marcus kept his voice level, the way he had learned during decades of translating in courtrooms and diplomatic chambers, where emotion could derail everything. "And I just watched you mistranslate everything Mrs. Blackwood has been trying to tell this board." Richard Blackwood stood from his chair in fusion, and something that might have been shame crossing his features. "I was translating for my mother. I've been doing it for years. You've been giving them what you understood." Marcus turned to look directly at Eleanor, and his hands began to move with fluid precision, which was about 40% of what she actually said. Eleanor's breath caught visibly. Her fingers began to form a response rapid and complex, the kind of signing that came from 68 years of living in this language. Marcus watched, processed, and spoke aloud without hesitation. "Mrs. Blackwood says she has been trying to explain that this project is not charity. The South Bronx development represents sustainable community investment. She has financial projections, risk assessments, and a clear path to both social impact and long-term profitability, none of which has been accurately communicated to this board in the 18 months since she proposed it." The room erupted. Directors who had been checking phones suddenly found themselves paying attention. Bradford's carefully constructed narrative about Eleanor's declining faculties crumbled with each word Marcus spoke. Margaret Foster, who had voted against 3 of Eleanor's initiatives in the past year, looked like someone had just told her the sky was actually green. Bradford recovered faster than the others. Men like him always did. "This is absurd. Richard gets security to remove this man." "I am security." Marcus did not smile, but something shifted in his expression. "Night shift floors 38 through 42. 6 months now. And I've watched every late-night meeting, every conversation you thought nobody was witnessing. Mrs. Blackwood may not hear your words, Mr. Sterling, but I do. And she reads your lies better than you think." Eleanor's hands moved again, and Marcus translated without breaking eye contact with Bradford. "She wants to know if you've actually read the 81-page impact study from Columbia University. Or did you stop at the executive summary because the full report contradicted everything you have been telling this board?" Bradford's mask slipped for just a moment. Fear flickered behind his eyes before corporate composure reasserted itself. This meeting is over. We'll reconvene when appropriate personnel are present. Actually, Dr. Catherine Wilson stood and her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent 30 years refusing to be silenced. I think this meeting is just getting started, and I want to hear what else Mrs. Blackwood has been trying to tell us. 12 hours earlier, Marcus Cole had been exactly what Bradford Sterling assumed he was, an aging security guard finishing a night shift that paid $18 an hour. He had walked these halls in the small hours when the building was empty, except for the soft hum of climate control and the occasional flicker of a screensaver in an abandoned office. He had grown accustomed to the particular loneliness of working while the world slept, the way his footsteps echoed differently at 3 in the morning than they would have at 3 in the afternoon. The apartment in Cleveland waited for him at the end of each shift, though he had been staying in New York for 6 months now, subletting a studio in Queens that cost more than his mortgage back home, but put him close enough to this job to make it work. The decision to uproot his life at 58 had not been easy, but the alternative was worse. 23 applications for interpreter positions after his life fell apart, and 23 rejections that all said the same thing in different words: too old, not the right fit, looking for someone with more contemporary experience. Contemporary experience. As if the language had somehow changed in the 30 years since he had started. As if the grammar of AISL had been rewritten while he was busy raising a son and building a life and watching both of those things slip away. Maya was the reason he had taken this job, despite every instinct telling him it was beneath him. His granddaughter, 8 years old, now born deaf and born beautiful, and born into a world that still had not figured out how to treat people who experienced it differently. Her father, Marcus's son David, had been a firefighter, the kind of man who ran toward danger while everyone else ran away. The kind of man who went into a burning building in the Bronx 2 years ago and never came out. Marcus kept a photograph of David in his wallet, worn at the edges from being held too many times. Next to it, a picture of Linda, his wife of 31 years, who had fought cancer with the same quiet determination she had brought to everything else in her life. She had lost that fight 14 months before David died, and sometimes Marcus wondered if his son had stopped being careful because the person who had always pulled him back from the edge was no longer there to do it. The money from Linda's life insurance had gone to David's funeral. The money from David's line-of-duty death benefits went into an account labeled Maya's Future. What remained was barely enough to keep the lights on in the Cleveland house and put food on the table for a growing girl who needed specialist schools and medical appointments, and all the invisible expenses that came with raising a child in a world not designed for her. Maya lived with her grandmother now. David's mother-in-law, a kind woman named Patricia, who had stepped in when it became clear that Marcus could not work and care for an 8-year-old at the same time. The arrangement was supposed to be temporary. Patricia's health was not what it had been, and everyone knew that sooner rather than later, Maya would need to come live with Marcus full-time, which meant Marcus needed stable income health insurance, a life that could accommodate a deaf child's needs. Security guard at Blackwood Enterprises was not the answer to those problems, but it was $18 an hour, and it was better than the nothing he had been earning while sending out applications that disappeared into the void of corporate recruiting systems designed to filter out anyone over 45. The first time Marcus saw Eleanor Blackwood, he had not known who she was. Just an older woman working late on the 42nd floor, her hands moving in conversation with herself, the way deaf people often did when thinking through complex problems. He had been doing his rounds checking locks and emergency exits when he passed the glass wall of the main conference room and saw her there alone with stacks of paper and a look of profound exhaustion. Her hands caught his attention first. The fluency was unmistakable. This was not someone who had learned ASL as a second language later in life. This was native signing, the kind that came from growing up in the language, from thinking in it rather than translating from English. Marcus had seen enough to know the difference. He should have kept walking. That was the job. Check the door note, the presence of an authorized person working late, move on to the next checkpoint. But something made him pause, and in that pause, Eleanor looked up and saw him watching. Most people would have been startled, maybe alarmed. A security guard staring through glass at 2 in the morning could mean trouble. But Eleanor's expression shifted to something else entirely. Curiosity assessment, the sharp intelligence of a woman who had survived in business long enough to read people the way other people read books. Marcus raised his hand and signed a simple apology for disturbing her. The effect was electric. Eleanor's eyes widened and she signed back a question. ASL, 25 years as a federal interpreter. Marcus spelled out his credentials in fingerspelling, then added the sign for respect. I'll leave you to your work, ma'am. But Eleanor was already standing, already moving toward the glass door that separated them. She opened it, and for a long moment, they just looked at each other, the billionaire founder in her designer clothes, the security guard in his uniform, two people from worlds that were never supposed to intersect. What's your name? Eleanor signed. Marcus Cole. Why are you here, Marcus Cole, working nights as a security guard? There were many ways to answer that question, and Marcus chose the simplest. Because nobody else would hire me. Eleanor studied him with the particular intensity of someone who had spent a lifetime being underestimated. Then she nodded once, a gesture that seemed to contain multitudes, and returned to her conference room full of papers. Marcus continued his rounds, but something had shifted in the invisible geography of that building. He had been seen, truly seen, for the first time in months. 2 weeks later, Bradford Sterling taught Marcus what it meant to be invisible in a different way entirely. The incident happened in the hallway outside the executive elevator bank. Marcus had arrived early to handle a maintenance issue, a sticking lock on one of the emergency stairwell doors that needed attention before the day shift arrived. He was on his knees with a screwdriver when the elevator doors opened, and Bradford Sterling emerged with three men who looked like the kind of clients companies needed to impress. Bradford was in the middle of a story, something about a yacht club and a senator, the sort of casual name-dropping that positioned him as a man who moved in important circles. He was not watching where he was walking. His Italian leather shoe caught on Marcus's toolkit, and Bradford stumbled, nearly losing his balance before catching himself on the wall. The transformation was immediate. Bradford's face contorted with rage, and he looked down at Marcus the way someone might look at a roach that had crawled across their dinner plate. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Marcus stood, keeping his voice neutral. "Fixing the stairwell door, sir. The lock was reported as—" "I don't care about the lock." Bradford turned to his guest with an exaggerated eye roll. "This is the problem with these companies now. Hire these old guys because they're cheap and they can't even stay out of the way." The client shifted uncomfortably. One of them offered a weak laugh. Marcus felt the heat rising in his chest, but kept it contained the way he had learned to contain everything since Linda died. Bradford was not finished. "How old are you?" 60, 65. "Shouldn't you be in some retirement home watching game shows? Instead, you're here getting in the way of people who actually matter." "I'm 58, sir." Marcus picked up his toolkit. "And I'll be out of your way in just a moment." "You should be out of everyone's way." Bradford smoothed his jacket, composure returning now that he had established dominance. "That's what invisible means, in case nobody explained it to you. You don't exist. You fix things and then you disappear. Think you can manage that?" Marcus said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not cost him this job and the $18 an hour that stood between Maya and uncertainty. He simply nodded and stepped aside, and Bradford let his clients pass without another glance, already resuming his story about the senator as if the interruption had never happened. Eleanor Blackwood stood at the end of the hallway, partially hidden by a decorative column. She had seen everything. Her expression was unreadable, but her hands moved in a simple phrase that Marcus caught before she turned and walked away. "I know that feeling." The encounter changed something between them. Not immediately, not obviously, but in the way that small moments sometimes become the foundation for larger structures. 2 nights later, Eleanor found Marcus during his rounds and invited him to her office. The invitation itself was unusual, founder of an $800 million company requesting the presence of a night security guard, but Eleanor Blackwood had built her empire on unusual decisions. Her office was not what Marcus had expected. He had seen the executive suites on the 41st floor, all chrome and glass, in aggressive minimalism designed to intimidate. Eleanor's space was different. Books lined the walls, actual physical books, their spines cracked from use rather than displayed for effect. Photographs sat on every available surface, though Marcus noticed that most of them showed Eleanor alone or with employees, rarely with family. "Sit down, Marcus Cole." Eleanor signed the words while gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "I have questions." Marcus sat acutely aware of the contrast between his uniform and the leather chair that probably cost more than his car. "What would you like to know?" "Why did you let him speak to you that way? Bradford Sterling is a fool and a bully. I saw your face. You wanted to say something." "Saying something would have cost me my job." I can't afford to lose this job. Because of the interpreter positions, you can't get. Marcus felt surprise register on his face before he could control it. You checked up on me. I own this building. I know everyone who works in it, even the ones the rest of the board forgets exist. Eleanor leaned forward, her signing becoming more emphatic. 25 years with the State Department. You translated for 3 presidents, the UN General Assembly, federal court proceedings at the highest levels, and now you're checking locks at 2 in the morning because nobody will hire a 58-year-old interpreter. That's about the size of it. Why not? Your credentials are impeccable. Marcus considered how much truth to offer. Something about Eleanor's directness made him want to respond in kind. Contemporary experience, that's what they all say. They want someone young, someone who fits their idea of what a modern professional looks like. They see gray hair and assume the skills underneath have expired. Eleanor's expression hardened. I built this company from nothing when I was 26 years old. Deaf since I was 8, no connections, no capital, no advantages, except the refusal to accept what everyone told me I couldn't do. And for the past 10 years, I have watched my own board treat me the way Bradford treated you in that hallway. Like something to be managed. Like a problem to be solved. Your son translates for you in meetings. My son catches maybe half of what I say and turns the rest into what he thinks I should have meant. Richard is a good man, but he never really learned the language. He was embarrassed by it when he was young, embarrassed by me being different, and by the time he outgrew that embarrassment, it was too late to become fluent. Marcus understood the dynamic immediately. He had seen it in countless families where hearing parents struggled to communicate with deaf children, or where deaf parents found themselves isolated from hearing offspring who had never prioritized the language that connected them. What do you want from me, Mrs. Blackwood? Eleanor's hands formed the next sentence with deliberate precision. I want you to help me understand what's happening in my own company. Someone is working against me. I see it in the votes that don't go my way, in the initiatives that get blocked, in the way conversations stop when I enter a room. I know something is wrong, but I can't prove it because I can't hear the conversations happening behind my back. And you think I can help with that? You move through this building like a ghost. People speak freely when they think nobody is listening. And you have skills. I need not just the language, but the ability to read what people aren't saying. Marcus sat with the request for a long moment. There were ethical considerations, professional boundaries, questions about where corporate espionage ended and legitimate investigation began. But there was also something in Eleanor's eyes that reminded him of Maya, that particular desperation of someone fighting to be heard in a world that had decided not to listen. If I help you and it goes wrong, I lose more than this job. If you help me and it goes right, you gain more than you can imagine. Eleanor's signing became softer, more personal. I'm 76 years old, Marcus. I don't know how many years I have left to fix what's broken in the company I built. But I know I can't do it alone, and I know I can't trust anyone on my executive team. The security guard they treat like furniture, maybe I can trust him. Marcus thought about Bradford Sterling's voice dripping with contempt. He thought about Maya growing up in a world that would treat her the way Bradford treated anyone he considered beneath him. He thought about Linda, who had always told him that his gift for listening was meant for more than he knew. Where do you want me to start? Eleanor reached into her desk and pulled out a thick folder. Bradford has been sending emails to the board for 6 months. My son summarizes them for me, but I don't trust his summaries anymore. I need someone who can read between the lines. Marcus took the folder. It was heavy with printed emails, corporate communications meeting minutes, the kind of paper trail that told stories to anyone trained to look. And what do you expect to find? Eleanor's answer was simple and devastating. Proof that they're trying to take my company while pretending to respect me. Proof that Bradford Sterling is exactly what I've always suspected him to be. The investigation began slowly, carefully in the margins of Marcus's regular duties. He learned to extend his rounds on the executive floors, to linger near offices where late-night conversations might reveal what daytime discretion concealed. He read the emails Eleanor provided with the same analytical intensity he had once applied to diplomatic communications, looking not just at what people said, but at the patterns in how they said it. Bradford Sterling's correspondence was a masterclass in corporate manipulation. On the surface, every email expressed concern for Eleanor's well-being, respect for her legacy, appreciation for her contributions to the company she had founded. But underneath the professional courtesy, Marcus found a different story. Bradford never used Eleanor's name when communicating with other board members. She was always our founder, or the chairwoman, or most tellingly, Mrs. Blackwood's situation. The distancing language was deliberate, transforming a person into a problem to be managed. His suggestions always came wrapped in sympathy. Given the communication challenges we've been experiencing in recent meetings, as we all want what's best for Mrs. Blackwood's legacy, perhaps it's time to consider how we can honor her contributions while moving the company forward. Every phrase was designed to plant the idea that Eleanor was no longer capable without ever directly saying so. Marcus documented everything. He created a timeline showing how Bradford's campaign had escalated over 3 years, starting with subtle questions about Eleanor's engagement in board discussions and progressing to explicit suggestions that the company needed fresh perspectives and dynamic leadership. He mapped the voting patterns, showing how Bradford had systematically cultivated alliances with board members who had previously supported Eleanor's initiatives. The pattern was clear, but patterns were not proof. Marcus needed something concrete, something that would expose Bradford's true intentions beyond any possibility of denial. He found it on a Tuesday night in March, 3 months into his investigation. Marcus was finishing his rounds on the 41st floor when he heard voices from Bradford's office. The door was closed but not properly latched, leaving a gap that carried sound into the empty hallway. Under normal circumstances, Marcus would have noted the occupied office and moved on. But he recognized the voices: Bradford and Margaret Hayes, the CFO, who had been hired 18 months earlier from a company Marcus had never heard of, called Sterling Consulting. The name had bothered him from the first time he saw it in the corporate records. Sterling was not a common surname. The connection to Bradford seemed too convenient to be coincidental, but Marcus had found no evidence of a direct relationship. Tonight, the evidence found him. The transfers are getting harder to hide. Margaret's voice carried a tension that Marcus had not heard in her public persona. The auditors are asking questions about the consulting fees. The auditors work for us. Bradford sounded unconcerned. Handle them the way you have handled everything else. This is different. The amounts are getting too large to explain away. 2.3 million in 18 months, Bradford. That's not consulting fees, that's a pattern. Marcus pressed himself against the wall, barely breathing. His phone was in his pocket, recording. He had started carrying it on record during his rounds after the second week of investigation, just in case something exactly like this occurred. Sterling Consulting exists for a reason. Bradford's voice had shifted harder now, the charm stripped away. The money goes in as fees comes out clean on the other end. My accountants have been doing this for 15 years. We're fine. Your accountants haven't dealt with Eleanor Blackwood. She's been asking questions. Richard told me she wanted to see the detailed breakdowns for Q3. Eleanor can barely participate in board meetings anymore. Her son manages everything, and Richard believes whatever we tell him. But what if she brings in outside help? She has the resources. She won't. That would mean admitting she can't handle her own company. Eleanor Blackwood's pride is our greatest asset. Bradford laughed, and the sound made Marcus's stomach turn. Besides, we're almost there. 6 more months, and the board will have enough concerns about her capacity to force the conversation about leadership transition. Once she's out, we control the narrative. The consulting fees become investment returns, the transfers become legitimate business expenses, and nobody asks questions about a company that's posting record profits. Marcus had heard enough. He moved away from this door silently, years of diplomatic work having taught him how to disappear when discovery meant disaster. His mind raced with the implications of what he had just learned. This was not just about pushing Eleanor out of her company. This was fraud, systematic, deliberate theft, disguised as corporate expenses. The numbers Margaret had mentioned matched what Marcus had seen in the financial reports Eleanor had shared with him, discrepancies he had flagged without understanding their source. Now he understood. The question was, what to do with the knowledge. Going to Eleanor directly would alert her, but it would also put both of them at risk. Bradford had made clear that he controlled the auditors, which meant internal channels were compromised. External authorities would require evidence more substantial than a recording made by a security guard, who had been eavesdropping on private conversations. Marcus needed documentation, physical proof that would stand up to scrutiny and could not be dismissed as the accusations of a disgruntled employee. He needed to build a case the way he had learned to build interpretations during his federal work, layer by layer, detail by detail, until the picture became impossible to deny. He also needed to protect himself and, by extension, Maya. If Bradford discovered what Marcus was doing, the retaliation would be swift and complete. Men like Bradford Sterling did not tolerate threats to their plans. They eliminated them. The next 3 months became a careful dance between Marcus's duties as a security guard and his secret work as an investigator. He learned the rhythms of the building, after hours knew which offices had security cameras and which had blind spots, understood when the cleaning crews came through and when the executive floors were truly empty. The HR records were his first target. He discovered a locked filing cabinet in a storage room on the 39th floor, tucked away behind boxes of outdated marketing materials. The lock was old and unsophisticated, the kind that yielded to patient manipulation rather than brute force. Inside, Marcus found 73 personnel files, all employees who had filed complaints about discrimination or harassment, all subsequently terminated for reasons ranging from restructuring to performance concerns. The pattern was undeniable. Every complaint had been handled the same way: initial acknowledgement investigation that found insufficient evidence, and then within 6 months separation from the company with a severance package that included a non-disclosure agreement. The NDAs were particularly telling. Each one specifically prohibited discussing the circumstances of the employee's departure, effectively buying silence in exchange for a few months' salary. Marcus photographed every file, every document, every signature. He created backup copies and stored them in multiple locations, understanding that evidence meant nothing if it could be destroyed before being presented. The financial investigation was more complex. Marcus did not have direct access to the accounting systems, but he learned to read the paper trails that Bradford and Margaret had been too confident to properly conceal. Expense reports signed by Bradford for consulting services that corresponded exactly to invoices from Sterling Consulting. Travel receipts for meetings at locations that Marcus verified had no connection to any legitimate business activity. A pattern of payments that flowed from Blackwood Enterprises to Sterling Consulting, and then Marcus suspected back to accounts controlled by Bradford himself. He shared his findings with Eleanor in carefully orchestrated meetings, always late at night, always in locations where they could not be observed. Her response evolved from skepticism to horror to cold, determined fury. "I trusted him." Eleanor's hands shook as she signed the words, reading through the documentation Marcus had compiled. "When Bradford joined the board, I thought he would bring new energy, new perspectives. I invited him into my company. He used that trust against you." Marcus kept his own signing steady at a counterpoint to her distress. "Everything he's done has been designed to isolate you, undermine your authority, and eventually remove you from the company you built." The 73 employees. Eleanor's eyes glistened. "I remember some of these names. They came to me with concerns, and I told them to work through HR. I told them the system would protect them." The system was designed to protect Bradford, and I let it happen. Eleanor set down the papers and looked at Marcus with an expression that contained equal parts gratitude and shame. "While I was fighting to be heard in my own boardroom, these people were being silenced because I didn't pay attention, because I let my own struggles blind me to theirs." Marcus reached across the desk and placed his hand over Eleanor's. The gesture surprised both of them, the formality that had defined their interactions giving way to something more human. "You can't fix what you didn't know, but you can fix what happens next." Eleanor turned her hand to grip his, holding on as if anchoring herself against a storm. "What do you suggest?" "We need more. The recordings I have, the documents, the patterns, it's enough to raise questions, but it's not enough to guarantee answers. Bradford has lawyers and accountants and board members who will defend him. We need something that proves intent beyond any possibility of denial." Such as, Marcus had thought about this question for weeks, considering and discarding options until only one remained. "We need him to admit it. On the record, in a setting where he can't claim the evidence was fabricated or taken out of context. A board meeting. A board meeting where you finally get to speak for yourself, where every word is translated accurately, where every piece of evidence is presented properly, where Bradford Sterling is forced to defend the indefensible in front of people he's been manipulating for years. Eleanor was silent for a long moment, her eyes distant, calculating. Then she nodded once, the same decisive gesture she had offered when they first met. I have one more piece of evidence, something I've been keeping in reserve. She reached into her desk and withdrew a USB drive. Richard gave this to me last week. Bradford sent it to him apparently as some kind of proof that they were aligned on the succession plan. Richard didn't open it, but I did. What's on it? Video. Bradford in his office talking to someone off camera about how Eleanor is losing it and how once she's retired, they'll have freedom to expand operations. His exact words. Marcus felt the weight of the moment settle around them. This was the piece they had been missing, Bradford's own voice, his own face, his own words condemning him. When do you want to do this? Eleanor's hands formed the answer with absolute certainty. The next board meeting, 2 weeks from now, the vote on the South Bronx project. That's the one Bradford has been working to kill. That's the one he thinks he's already won. Eleanor's smile was thin and sharp. He's going to learn what it feels like to have everything taken away by someone you never thought mattered. The 2 weeks before the board meeting passed in a blur of preparation and paranoia. Marcus continued his security rounds while simultaneously coordinating with Eleanor on strategy, evidence presentation, and contingency plans. They communicated through encrypted messages during the day and face-to-face meetings during his night shifts, always aware that Bradford might discover their plot at any moment. Maya called him 3 times during those weeks. Each conversation carved another piece from Marcus's heart. The first call came on a Sunday afternoon, Patricia's voice in the background mentioning something about a science project. Maya's hands appeared on the video screen, signing with the particular enthusiasm of an 8-year-old who had discovered something wonderful. Pop, I'm building a model of the solar system. Saturn has rings and Jupiter has a big red spot. And did you know Pluto isn't a planet anymore? Marcus smiled despite the weight he carried. I did know that, sunshine. Some scientists decided it was too small. That's not fair. Small things can be important too. You're absolutely right. Small things can be very important. Maya's expression shifted, becoming more serious in the way children sometimes did when they sensed things adults tried to hide. Pop, when are you coming home? The question landed like a physical blow. Soon, Maya, as soon as I can. Patricia says her knees hurt too much to take me to the park anymore. She tries to hide it, but I can tell. I know, sunshine. Just a little longer and then we'll figure everything out. Promise, Marcus felt the word catch in his throat. Promises were sacred things not to be offered lightly or broken without consequence. I promise. The second call came 4 days before the board meeting, and Maya's mood was different, darker, angrier, her hands moving with sharp, aggressive gestures. A boy at school called me stupid. Her signs were like punches, each one landing with force. He said deaf people can't think right. He said my brain is broken. Marcus felt the rage rise in him, hot and immediate, the protective fury of a grandfather who would destroy anything that hurt his grandchild. But rage would not help Maya, so he forced himself to respond with calm he did not feel. What did you do? I pushed him. Maya's defiance flickered into uncertainty. I got in trouble. Patricia had to come pick me up early. Maya, look at me. Marcus waited until her eyes met his through the screen. What that boy said is wrong, completely, absolutely wrong. Your brain works perfectly. It just works differently than his. And different is not broken. Then why do people treat me like I'm broken? Because some people are scared of things they don't understand. They see someone who experiences the world differently, and instead of learning about that difference, they decide it must be wrong. That's not about you, Maya, that's about them. But it hurts. Her signs grew smaller, more vulnerable. When they say those things, it hurts. I know, sunshine, it hurts when people don't see who you really are. But here's what I need you to remember. You are exactly who you are supposed to be. You are brilliant and curious and kind. And one day you are going to show everyone who ever doubted you exactly how wrong they were. How do you know? Because I'm doing the same thing right now. Someone told me I was too old to matter. Someone said I should disappear. And I'm about to show them that people like us, people they think are invisible, we see everything. And we don't stay quiet forever. Maya's expression shifted, curiosity replacing hurt. What are you doing, Pop Pop? I'm helping someone who needs a voice, just like I help you. Is it scary? Marcus considered, lying protecting her from the complexity of adult fears. But Maya deserved better than comfortable lies. Yes, it's scary, but I'm doing it anyway because some things are more important than being afraid. I love you, Pop Pop. Maya's signs were softer now, the anger drained away. Bigger than the sky. I love you too, sunshine. Bigger than the squash pie. The third call came the night before the board meeting, and it was the shortest, but the most significant. Maya appeared on the screen already in her pajamas, Patricia visible behind her, looking tired but smiling. I talked to Mom today. Maya's signs were hesitant, careful. She told me about Daddy, about how he was brave even when he was scared. She said he went into the fire because somebody needed help even though he knew it was dangerous. Marcus felt his throat tighten. They did not talk about David often. The wound was still too raw, the grief too heavy. Your daddy was the bravest man I ever knew. Patricia says you're like him. She says you help people too, just in different ways. I try to be like him. I don't know if I succeed. You do? Maya's conviction was absolute, the way only a child's faith could be. I know you do. And whatever you're doing tomorrow, you're going to be brave like Daddy. Because that's who you are. Marcus could not speak for a moment, the emotions too large for words. Finally, he signed back the only response that mattered. Thank you, sunshine. Thank you for believing in me. Always, Pop Pop, always. The morning of the board meeting, Marcus woke before dawn. He had not slept well, fragments of dreams about David and Linda and Maya all mixed together in ways that made no coherent sense. But he rose anyway, showered, put on the clean shirt he had been saving for this occasion. He was not attending as a security guard today. Eleanor had arranged for him to be present as her personal interpreter, a role that would give him access to the meeting while maintaining the appearance of professional legitimacy. Bradford would see him and wonder, but he would not have grounds to object. Eleanor was entitled to interpreter services, and Marcus was qualified to provide them. The Blackwood Enterprises boardroom looked different in daylight. Sun streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the mahogany table and leather chairs in tones of gold and amber. The 12 seats were already filling when Marcus and Eleanor arrived, board members settling into positions that reflected 3 years of careful political maneuvering. Bradford Sterling sat at the foot of the table directly opposite Eleanor's position at the head. His expression flickered when he saw Marcus, a momentary crack in the smooth facade before corporate composure reasserted itself. Mrs. Blackwood, Bradford's voice was honey over razors. I see you've arranged for professional interpretation today. A welcome change from Richard's efforts, I'm sure. Richard, who had taken a seat along the wall rather than at the table, flushed red. Eleanor did not acknowledge the insult to her son. She simply took her seat and waited. The meeting proceeded through routine business for the first 90 minutes. Financial reports, operations updates, committee, summaries, the machinery of corporate governance grinding through its predetermined agenda. Marcus translated everything, his voice providing Eleanor with access to discussions that had been closed to her for years. The real battle began when they reached Agenda Item 7, the South Bronx Affordable Housing Development Project. Bradford cleared his throat, the small sound commanding attention through its casualness. Before we discuss this matter, I want to acknowledge the hard work Eleanor has put into this proposal. Her passion for community investment is well documented and deeply respected. The words sounded like praise. Marcus heard them as the opening move in an assassination. However, Bradford let the word hang in the air. As stewards of shareholder value, we must consider whether this particular expression of social responsibility aligns with our fiduciary obligations. I've prepared an analysis showing that a luxury condominium development on the same site would generate 22% returns compared to the 8% projected for affordable housing. He distributed folders around the table, each one containing spreadsheets and projections designed to make the numbers tell his story. Furthermore, I have concerns about the complexity of this project and whether it's realistic to expect successful execution given the current communication challenges we face in our leadership structure. There it was. The coded language, the careful insinuation that Eleanor's deafness made her incapable of handling complex business decisions. Marcus felt his hands tighten into fists beneath the table. Eleanor's hands began to move, and Marcus translated with precision, born of months of frustration. Miss Blackwood asks if Mr. Sterling has read the full impact study from Columbia University or only the executive summary. Bradford smiled without warmth. I've reviewed the relevant sections. Eleanor continued signing, and Marcus delivered each word like a blade. Mrs. Blackwood observes that the relevant sections are the 78 pages Mr. Sterling apparently skipped. Those pages explain exactly how the project generates both financial returns and social impact, how the tax credits and municipal partnerships reduce risk, and how community investment creates long-term brand value that cannot be captured in quarterly projections. The board members shifted uncomfortably. This was a different Eleanor than they had seen in recent years, sharp, prepared speaking through a translator who caught every nuance and delivered it without dilution. Bradford's mask slipped slightly. With respect, perhaps we should table this discussion until we can ensure everyone has access to the same information. Mrs. Blackwood has additional information she would like to share with the board. Marcus reached into his bag and withdrew the folders Eleanor had prepared, specifically an independent audit of the company's finances over the past 18 months conducted by investigators with no connection to Blackwood Enterprises. The temperature in the room dropped by 10 degrees. Bradford's face went pale. This is highly irregular. His voice carried an edge that had not been there before. Whatever concerns Mrs. Blackwood should be addressed through proper corporate channels. Mrs. Blackwood observes that the proper corporate channels have been compromised. Marcus continued distributing the folders. The audit documents a pattern of fraudulent consulting fees paid to a shell company called Sterling Consulting. Total amount, $2.3 million over 18 months. The payments were authorized by Mr. Sterling and processed through the CFO, Margaret Hayes, who previously worked for Sterling Consulting before being hired by Blackwood Enterprises. The boardroom erupted. Directors were talking over each other, opening folders, demanding explanations. Margaret Hayes had turned the color of old paper, her eyes darting between Bradford and the nearest exit. Bradford stood his chair, scraping back against the hardwood floor. This is slander. I won't sit here and be accused by some... He stopped, visibly struggling to find words that would not reveal his contempt. By someone who has no standing to make these accusations. Mr. Sterling, Marcus's voice cut through the chaos with the precision of a surgeon's blade. I have 25 years of experience reading what people say and what they mean. I know the difference between slander and truth. And I know what you called Mrs. Blackwood when you thought nobody was listening. I don't know what you're talking about. Eleanor reached into her briefcase and withdrew the USB drive. She handed it to Dr. Catherine Wilson, who plugged it into the conference room's display system. The video filled the screen. Bradford in his office relaxed, confident, speaking to someone off camera with the casual arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. Eleanor's losing it. Everyone can see it. Once she's retired, we'll have freedom to expand operations. The old woman has been holding this company back for years. It's time for real leadership. The video ended. The silence that followed was absolute. Bradford looked around the room at the board members who would not meet his eyes at Margaret Hayes, who was already reaching for her phone to call a lawyer at Eleanor Blackwood, sitting at the head of the table with an expression of terrible, patient triumph. His gaze finally landed on Marcus, and the hatred there was pure and undiluted. You're nobody. Bradford's voice was barely a whisper. You're a security guard, a janitor, an old man who should have stayed invisible. Marcus stood, and in that moment he felt the weight of everything that had led to this point: Linda's death, David's sacrifice, Maya's struggles, every rejection and humiliation and small indignity he had swallowed in the past 3 years. But he also felt something else, the strength that came from refusing to accept the story others wanted to write for you. You're right, I'm nobody important, just an old man with working ears and a granddaughter who's going to grow up in a world that tells her she doesn't matter because she's different. He paused, letting the words settle. I spent 6 months being invisible in this building. I watched you dismiss people, demean them, treat them like furniture. And the whole time I was listening. Marcus turned to face the entire board, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had finally found his purpose. Language is a weapon. I was trained to understand that weapon, to translate not just words but intentions. And I understood exactly what Mr. Sterling intended from the first day I heard him speak. He intended to steal this company from the woman who built it to silence anyone who opposed him and to make himself rich on the labor of people he considered beneath his notice. He looked at Eleanor, whose eyes glistened with tears she refused to shed. Mrs. Blackwood asked me once why I took this job. I told her it was because nobody else would hire me. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. I took this job because I needed to remember what my skills were for, not for presidents or senators, for people like Eleanor, people like my granddaughter, people who deserve to be heard and keep getting told they don't matter. The boardroom was silent. Then Dr. Catherine Wilson spoke, her voice steady with controlled fury. I move for the immediate removal of Bradford Sterling from this board pending full investigation into the financial irregularities documented in this audit. Do I have a second? Seconded. Gregory Taylor's voice rang out. All in favor. 11 hands rose. Only Margaret Hayes abstained, and her abstention was rendered meaningless by the weight of the evidence against her. Bradford Sterling stood alone in the center of a room full of people who had finally stopped listening to him. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. For the first time in his life, Bradford Sterling had been rendered invisible. Security arrived 3 minutes later to escort him from the building. Marcus watched him go, feeling not triumph, but something more complicated: satisfaction, mixed with sorrow, justice tempered by the awareness of how long it had taken and how many people had been hurt along the way. Eleanor rose from her chair and walked to Marcus. The board members watched as she reached out and took his hands in hers, a gesture that bridged the distance between billionaire and security guard, between the powerful and the dismissed. Thank you. She signed the words, small and private, meant only for him, for giving me my voice back. Marcus signed his response with equal intimacy. You never lost your voice, you just needed someone who knew how to listen. The South Bronx affordable housing development was approved unanimously 20 minutes later. The vote was almost an afterthought, the real business of the day having been concluded in the moment when Bradford Sterling's empire of manipulation came crashing down. But Marcus Cole knew the story was far from over. The FBI would need to be contacted. Lawyers would be engaged. The 73 employees who had been silenced would need to be found and offered justice. And somewhere in Cleveland, an 8-year-old girl was waiting for her grandfather to come home and keep his promise. The work was only beginning. The federal building in Lower Manhattan carried a particular weight that Marcus had learned to recognize during his years translating for government agencies. Gray stone and bureaucratic efficiency, the architecture of institutions that moved slowly but carried the full force of American law when they finally acted. He sat in a conference room on the 14th floor 3 weeks after Bradford Sterling's removal from the Blackwood board, facing 2 FBI agents who had been assigned to what they were calling one of the largest corporate fraud cases in New York State history. Special Agent Rodriguez was younger than Marcus expected, maybe 40, with the kind of focused intensity that suggested she had chosen this career for reasons beyond the paycheck. Her partner, Agent Thornton, was closer to Marcus's age, gray at the temples, the weathered patience of someone who had seen enough white-collar criminals to know that the biggest thieves usually wore the nicest suits. Mr. Cole, we've reviewed the documentation you provided. Rodriguez spread photographs across the table, images Marcus had taken during his months of investigation, each one time-stamped and cataloged. The evidence is substantial, but we need to understand the chain of custody. How exactly did you obtain access to these files? Marcus kept his hands flat on the table, a conscious choice to project calm even as his heart rate elevated. I was employed as night security at Blackwood Enterprises. My duties included regular rounds of the executive floors. During those rounds, I observed conversations and discovered documents that indicated potential criminal activity. You were eavesdropping. Thornton's voice carried no judgment, merely clarification. I was doing my job. Part of security work involves being aware of unusual activity. What I witnessed qualified. Rodriguez leaned forward. The recordings you made of Mr. Sterling's conversations. New York is a one-party consent state for recordings, but you weren't a party to those conversations. You were listening from outside the room. I was present on premises where I was authorized to be, performing duties I was authorized to perform. The conversations I recorded took place in spaces that were not secured against observation. Mr. Sterling chose to discuss criminal activity in an office with an unlocked door while a security guard was making rounds in the hallway. The agents exchanged glances. Marcus had anticipated this challenge and prepared his response carefully. The legal distinction between surveillance and observation was thin, but it existed, and his position on the right side of that line was defensible. Mrs. Blackwood has provided independent corroboration. Rodriguez shifted focus. The audit she commissioned confirms the financial discrepancies you identified. Sterling Consulting received $2.3 million for services that were never rendered. The money went into accounts controlled by Bradford Sterling and his associates. Marcus had traced the flow during his investigation following paper trails that Bradford had been too arrogant to properly conceal. Margaret Hayes, the CFO, facilitated the transfers. James Chen in HR buried the discrimination complaints that might have drawn attention to the broader pattern of misconduct. We've already executed search warrants on Sterling's residence and offices. Thornton pulled out a tablet, scrolling through images. Found additional documentation that supports your timeline. The man kept records. Arrogance or stupidity, hard to say which. Usually both. Marcus had seen enough powerful men fall to recognize the pattern. People like Bradford believe their position protects them. They stop being careful because they have never faced consequences. Rodriguez closed her folder with the particular finality of someone reaching a decision. Mr. Cole, we'd like you to testify before a federal grand jury. Your direct observations will be critical in establishing the pattern of fraud and the involvement of multiple conspirators. I'll do whatever is necessary. You should understand what that means. Rodriguez's expression carried warning beneath the professional neutrality. Sterling has resources. His family's lawyers are already preparing a defense strategy that will include attacking your credibility. They'll investigate your background, your finances, your family. They'll look for anything that might discredit your testimony. Marcus thought about Maya, about Patricia's declining health, about the modest savings account that represented everything he had left in the world. Let them look. I have nothing to hide. It's not about hiding. Thornton's voice softened slightly. It's about preparation. These cases can take years. The pressure doesn't stop when the trial starts, it intensifies. Are you prepared for that? The question deserved honest consideration. Marcus had spent his professional life translating for others, occupying the space between speakers without becoming the focus of attention. What Rodriguez and Thornton were describing would put him at the center of everything, exposed to scrutiny he had never experienced, and attacks he could not fully anticipate. But then he thought about the 73 employees whose complaints had been buried, about Eleanor isolated in her own company for years, about Maya growing up in a world that would tell her she was less than because she experienced it differently. I'm prepared. The words carried the weight of everything he had lost and everything he still hoped to protect. Some fights are worth having, even when they're hard, especially when they're hard. Rodriguez nodded, something like respect flickering in her eyes. We'll be in touch about scheduling. In the meantime, document any contact from Sterling's representatives. If anyone approaches you, if you notice surveillance, if anything feels wrong, call us immediately. The meeting ended with handshakes and business cards, the formal machinery of justice beginning to turn. Marcus walked out of the federal building into March sunlight that felt thin and uncertain, spring still fighting to establish itself against lingering winter. His phone buzzed as he reached the subway entrance. A message from Eleanor. Dinner tonight, we should talk about next steps. He typed back confirmation, then descended into the underground, the weight of what was coming settling around his shoulders like a coat he would wear for months or years to come. Eleanor's penthouse occupied the top floor of a pre-war building on the Upper East Side, old money architecture that had survived decades of Manhattan's relentless transformation. The doorman recognized Marcus now. 3 weeks of regular visits had established him as someone authorized to ascend without question. The elevator rose 32 floors in velvet silence, depositing him in a private foyer where Eleanor waited with the door already open. She had changed since Bradford's removal. The tension that had lived in her shoulders seemed to have loosened, though Marcus could still read the residual wariness in her eyes. Trust once broken, rebuilt slowly. The FBI meeting went well. Eleanor signed as she led him into the living room. They want me to testify before a grand jury. The case is expanding. They've found evidence connecting Bradford to similar schemes in 3 other companies. Eleanor's hands paused, processing the scope of what Marcus had described. He was running the same fraud in multiple places. Over 15 years, apparently. Blackwood was just the latest target, the largest but not the only one. They settled into chairs by the window, the Manhattan skyline spreading beneath them in patterns of light and shadow. Eleanor poured tea from a pot that had been steeping chamomile. Marcus noted the particular variety she preferred when she needed calm. Richard came to see me today. Eleanor's signs carried complicated emotion. He's been taking ASL classes, 3 hours every day since the board meeting. That's significant. He apologized, not just for the translation failures for everything, for being embarrassed by my deafness when he was young, for pulling away instead of learning to connect, for letting Bradford manipulate him because it was easier than confronting the truth. Marcus watched Eleanor's face as she communicated, reading the layers beneath the signs. How did you respond? I told him that apologies matter less than change, that I've spent 40 years building something I thought would outlast me, and I almost lost it because I couldn't trust my own son to understand me. Eleanor's hands slowed. I told him I wanted to trust him again, but trust is earned through action, not words. That's fair. Is it? Eleanor looked at Marcus with sudden intensity. I spent so many years being strong, being self-sufficient, refusing to depend on anyone, because depending on people meant giving them power to hurt me. My husband left because he couldn't handle being married to someone difficult. My son learned that my deafness was something to be managed rather than embraced. I built walls so high I couldn't see over them anymore. Marcus recognized the confession for what it was, an offering of vulnerability from someone who had spent decades protecting herself against exactly this kind of exposure. The walls kept you safe. The walls kept me isolated. There's a difference. Eleanor set down her teacup. When you walked into that conference room and started translating for me, really translating, not just converting words, but carrying meaning, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt heard, not accommodated, not managed, not tolerated, heard. That's what interpretation is supposed to do. But it's not what I usually experience. Most interpreters translate the content without the context. They give people my words, but not my voice. You gave me my voice back. The conversation had shifted into territory Marcus had not anticipated. He was accustomed to professional boundaries, to the careful distance that interpretation required. But Eleanor was not his client in the traditional sense. She was something more complicated, a collaborator and ally, whose connection to him had deepened through shared struggle. I should tell you something. Eleanor's hands moved with deliberate care. After Andrew left my husband, I decided I would never depend on anyone again. Romantic relationships were vulnerabilities I couldn't afford. I've been alone for 20 years, and I convinced myself that was strength. It takes strength to survive alone. It takes more strength to let someone in. Eleanor met his eyes directly. I'm 76 years old. I've built an empire, raised a son, survived betrayal by people I trusted. And somehow in the middle of all that, I forgot how to let anyone close enough to actually know me. Marcus understood what she was saying without her needing to spell it out. The connection between them had evolved from professional necessity into something deeper. Not romance in the conventional sense, but genuine intimacy of the kind that emerged when two people saw each other clearly and chose to remain present anyway. I'm 58. His voice carried the weight of confession. I lost my wife 4 years ago and my son 2 years after that. I've been so focused on surviving, on taking care of Maya, on just getting through each day, that I forgot what it felt like to want something for myself. What do you want, Marcus Cole? The question hung between them, demanding honesty. I want to matter, not for what I can do, but for who I am. I want someone to see me as more than a translator, more than a grandfather, more than a widower trying to hold the pieces together. He paused. I want to build something new. I thought that part of my life was over, but maybe I was wrong. Eleanor reached across the space between them and took his hand. The touch was simple human carrying, none of the freight that words sometimes accumulated. Two people who had been alone finding their way toward connection. We don't have to define this. Eleanor's signing was gentle. We don't have to rush toward any particular destination, but I want you to know that whatever this becomes, I'm not going anywhere. and I'd like you to stay. Marcus squeezed her hand and answered that required no translation. The call from Patricia came at 3 in the morning, 4 days later. Marcus was asleep in his Queens apartment when his phone shattered the silence, Patricia's number glowing on the screen with the particular urgency of calls that came at bad hours. Marcus, I'm sorry to wake you. Patricia's voice was strained, fighting to stay calm. I'm at Cleveland Clinic. It's my heart. They're saying I need surgery, and I can't. Maya needs. I'm coming. Marcus was already moving, pulling on clothes in the dark. Is Maya with you? She's with the nurses. They set up a cot in my room, but she's scared, Marcus. She keeps asking when you're going to be here. Tell her I'm on my way. I'll catch the first flight I can find. The next hours passed in a blur of logistics and barely contained fear. A pre-dawn flight from LaGuardia, the particular purgatory of waiting in terminals when every minute stretched into eternity. Marcus texted Eleanor from the gate, explaining the situation in the compressed shorthand of crisis communication. Her response came immediately. Go. Take care of your family. The FBI can wait. I'll handle things here. He landed in Cleveland before noon and took a taxi directly to the hospital. The Cleveland Clinic was a city unto itself, labyrinthine corridors connecting buildings that had grown organically over decades of expansion. Marcus navigated by instinct and desperation, following signs toward the cardiac wing where Patricia waited. Maya saw him first. She was sitting in a chair outside Patricia's room, her small body hunched in on itself, arms wrapped around her knees. When she spotted Marcus coming down the hallway, she launched herself toward him like a projectile, her face buried in his chest before he could kneel to receive her. He held her without speaking, letting the embrace communicate what words could not. Her body shook with the particular trembling of a child who had been trying to be brave for too long. Finally, she pulled back enough to sign with hands that were unsteady. Patricia's heart is sick. The doctors say they need to fix it, but it's scary. What if something bad happens? Marcus knelt to bring himself to her eye level, his hands moving with the calm he had cultivated through years of interpreting in crisis situations. Patricia is in the best place she could be. These doctors know how to help her. And I'm here now. I'm not going anywhere. Promise? Maya's eyes searched his face for the reassurance she needed. I promise. We're going to get through this together. He stood and took her hand, leading her into Patricia's room. The woman who had stepped in to care for Maya when Marcus could not lay propped up in a hospital bed, wires connecting her to monitors that beeped with steady rhythm. She looked older than he remembered, the kind of aging that happened suddenly when the body finally admitted to carrying burdens it had been hiding. Marcus, Patricia's smile was weary but genuine. Thank you for coming so fast. He crossed to her bedside, taking her hand the way he had taken Eleanor's just days before. Tell me what the doctor said. The conversation that followed painted a picture Marcus had been dreading. Patricia's heart had been failing for months, symptoms she had dismissed as normal aging, until the episode that brought her to the emergency room. The surgery she needed was significant, a valve replacement that carried risks, particularly for someone her age. Recovery would take months, and even then her capacity to care for an active 8-year-old would be limited. I can't take care of Maya anymore. Patricia's voice broke on the admission. I wanted to. I love that girl like she was my own granddaughter. But my body won't let me keep pretending I'm capable of what she needs. Marcus looked at Maya, who had curled up in the corner chair, with the particular stillness of a child who understood she was being discussed, but could not follow the spoken conversation. He signed to her, keeping his expression gentle. Maya, can you go to the waiting area for a few minutes? There's a vending machine there and you can pick out a snack. I need to talk to Patricia about grown-up things. Maya nodded, understanding the request for privacy, even if she didn't like it. She left with the reluctant cooperation of a child who had learned that adults sometimes needed space to figure things out. What are my options? Marcus turned back to Patricia. She needs stability, a permanent home, a guardian who can give her the attention and support she deserves. Patricia's eyes glistened. I know you've been trying to get back on your feet. I know the situation in New York is complicated. But Maya needs her grandfather, full-time, not visits and phone calls. Marcus absorbed the weight of what Patricia was asking. He had known this moment would come, eventually had been working toward it, in fact hoping that his position at Blackwood would evolve into something that could support a child. But the timing was impossible. The FBI case was just beginning. His role as a witness would require his presence in New York for months, possibly years, and his current income, while stable, was nowhere near sufficient to provide for Maya the way she deserved. I want to take her. The words came out before he could qualify them. I've always wanted to take her, but I need to figure out how to make it work. David would want her with you. Patricia's hand tightened on his. He talked about it, before the fire. He said if anything ever happened to him, he wanted you to raise Maya. He said you were the only person who really understood her. The mention of his son hit Marcus like a physical blow. David had been gone 2 years, but the grief remained fresh, a wound that had scabbed over but never fully healed. I'll make it work. Marcus heard the determination in his own voice. Whatever I have to do, I'll make it work. Patricia's surgery was scheduled for 3 days later. Marcus spent that time in a strange limbo, dividing his hours between the hospital, the lawyers handling guardianship paperwork, and the particular intensity of being present for Maya in ways he had not been able to manage from New York. They walked through the Cleveland metro parks, Maya pointing out birds and plants with the enthusiasm of a naturalist in training. They ate breakfast at the diner David used to take her to on Sunday mornings, sitting in the same booth where her father had taught her to make faces out of pancake batter. They visited the school she would be leaving, collected her belongings from Patricia's house, began the slow process of dismantling one life to build another. At night, Maya slept in a hotel bed across from Marcus, her breathing even and peaceful in a way that suggested the security of having her grandfather close. But Marcus lay awake, staring at the ceiling, calculating figures that refused to add up. His salary at Blackwood, even the interpreter position Eleanor was creating for him, would not be enough to cover rent in New York childcare for Maya, the specialized educational services she needed. The savings he had accumulated over the years had been depleted by Linda's medical bills, David's funeral, the basic economics of survival. He had perhaps 3 months of financial runway before everything collapsed. The call from Eleanor came on the second night, her face appearing on his phone screen with the warmth of someone checking on a person she genuinely cared about. "How is Patricia?" Marcus signed his response, the visual language feeling more natural than speech in the quiet of the hotel room. "Scared but determined. Surgery is tomorrow morning." And Maya? "Adjusting. She's been incredible, actually. Stronger than any 8-year-old should have to be." Eleanor's expression shifted, reading something in Marcus's signs that he had not consciously communicated. "Something else is bothering you. What is it?" He hesitated, the instinct towards self-sufficiency warring with the vulnerability Eleanor had asked him to embrace. "I'm trying to figure out how to make this work. Taking Maya, bringing her to New York, building a life that can actually support her. The math doesn't add up." "What do you need?" "I don't know yet. I'm still calculating." "Marcus." Eleanor's signs became emphatic. "Stop calculating. Tell me what you need." The directness cut through his defenses. "I need a place to live that has room for a child. I need income that can cover her education, her medical expenses, the kind of support services a deaf child requires. I need to be available for her in ways that my current position doesn't allow. And I need to do all of that while also serving as a witness in a federal case that could consume years of my life." Eleanor was silent for a moment, processing. Then her hands began to move with a decisiveness that had built an $800 million company. "I've been thinking about restructuring the interpreter services at Blackwood, creating a proper department instead of relying on outside contractors. I need someone to run it, someone who understands both the language and the corporate environment, someone I trust." "Eleanor, the position would come with a salary appropriate for a director-level role. Housing assistance as part of the relocation package. Flexible scheduling that would accommodate both the FBI testimony and Maya's needs." Marcus felt the ground shifting beneath him. "You don't have to. I'm not doing this for you." Eleanor's signs carried gentle correction. "I'm doing this because it's the right decision for my company. I'm doing it because I spent years pretending I didn't need proper communication support, and I'm done pretending. And yes, I'm doing it because I care about you and Maya, and I want you to have the foundation you need to build something good." "That's a lot of reasons." "I'm a complicated woman." Eleanor's smile softened the edges of her determination. "Say yes, Marcus. Let someone help you for once. The word caught in his throat, weighted with years of independence and the particular pride of someone who had always taken care of others rather than being taken care of. But Eleanor had asked him to let someone in, and this was what letting someone in looked like. Yes, Patricia's surgery went well. The valve replacement proceeded without complications, and the doctors expressed cautious optimism about her recovery. Maya visited her in the ICU, careful not to touch the wires and tubes, signing messages of love that Patricia received with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Take care of my girl." Patricia's voice was weak but clear. "And take care of yourself, Marcus. You deserve good things too." The flight back to New York included one more passenger than the journey out. Maya sat by the window, her face pressed against the glass as Cleveland receded beneath them, watching the only city she had ever known become small enough to hold in her hand. "Pop, Pop." She turned to sign using the name she had called him since she was old enough to form the letters. "Are we going to be okay?" Marcus reached across to take her hand, the physical connection anchoring them both. "We're going to be better than okay. We're going to build something new together. And it's going to be hard sometimes, but hard doesn't mean impossible. It just means we have to work for it." Maya considered this with the particular seriousness of a child who had already learned that life did not always cooperate with plans. "I like working for things." Her signs were confident. "It makes them mean more when you get them." Marcus smiled, recognizing his own philosophy reflected back at him through his granddaughter's hands. "That's exactly right, sunshine. That's exactly right." New York in April carried the uncertain promise of spring days that could shift from warm to cold, within hours flowers fighting to emerge from soil that had not quite finished thawing. Marcus and Maya moved into an apartment in Brooklyn that Eleanor's company had arranged a two-bedroom unit in a building with good schools nearby and easy access to the subway lines that would carry Marcus to Manhattan for work. The adjustment period was exactly as difficult as Marcus had anticipated. Maya's school enrollment required mountains of paperwork. ISTEM, EP documentation, audiological reports, requests for interpreter services that the public school system was legally obligated to provide, but often slow to implement. Marcus spent hours on phone calls and in meetings advocating for his granddaughter with the same determination he had brought to advocating for Eleanor. The FBI case moved forward in parallel, a second full-time job that demanded Marcus's presence for depositions, evidence reviews, and preparation sessions that stretched into evenings. Special Agent Rodriguez had not exaggerated the complexity Bradford Sterling's lawyers were mounting, a defense that attacked everything they could find from the admissibility of Marcus's recordings to his qualifications to interpret the financial documents he had discovered. But the evidence was overwhelming, and even the most aggressive defense attorneys could not explain away the paper trail Bradford had left. Additional witnesses came forward as the investigation expanded. Former employees who had signed NDAs and now saw an opportunity to tell their stories. Colleagues from the other companies Bradford had defrauded, financial experts who traced the money flowing through Sterling Consulting into accounts that led directly back to the man himself. The grand jury indictment came in late April. 23 counts of fraud, embezzlement, witness tampering, and civil rights violations. Bradford Sterling, Margaret Hayes, and James Chen were all named, along with two additional conspirators whose involvement had emerged during the investigation. Marcus received the news at his desk in the new Blackwood Interpreter Services office, a space Eleanor had created specifically for the department he was building. The room was modest by executive standards, but represented everything Marcus had lost and rebuilt: professional recognition, financial stability, a purpose that extended beyond mere survival. His phone buzzed with a text from Eleanor. "Indictment just came through. Celebration dinner tonight." He typed back, "Maya has a school event at 6. Can we make it 8? "Perfect. Bring Maya if she wants to come. I have something for her." The school event was a science fair, Maya's first since transferring to her new school. She had been working on her project for weeks, a demonstration of how cochlear implants worked, complete with a model she had built from spare electronics and passionate explanations about the technology that might one day help her hear. Marcus stood at the back of the gymnasium, watching Maya present to a panel of judges who had been provided with an ASL interpreter through the school's accommodation services. His granddaughter's hands moved with confidence and precision, her face animated with the particular joy of someone sharing knowledge they found genuinely exciting. She did not win first place. That went to a project about photosynthesis that Marcus privately thought was less creative but more conventionally scientific. But Maya received an honorable mention for exceptional communication skills and innovative presentation approach. And her smile when they pinned the ribbon to her poster was worth more than any trophy. I didn't win. Maya signed it as they walked to the car, her tone matter-of-fact rather than disappointed. You communicated complex information clearly to an audience that didn't share your language. That's harder than any experiment. The judges said my presentation was the most engaging. They said they learned something new. Then you accomplished exactly what a good scientist should. You expanded human understanding. Maya considered this as she climbed into the car. Pop, why did you become an interpreter instead of something else? The question caught Marcus off guard. They had discussed his career before, but never with this particular philosophical depth. Because I wanted to connect people. Language is how we understand each other, how we share ideas and feelings, and everything that makes us human. When two people can't communicate directly, they lose access to each other. Interpretation gives that access back. Is that why you helped Mrs. Blackwood? Partly, but also because I saw someone being treated like they didn't matter, and I knew I could help. When you have skills that can make a difference, staying silent is a choice, and it's not a choice I could live with. Maya nodded slowly. I want to help people like that. When I grow up, I want to make sure nobody feels invisible because they're different. Marcus reached over and squeezed her hand. You already do that, sunshine. Every day, just by being yourself. Dinner at Eleanor's penthouse had evolved into something of a ritual over the past month. Maya and Eleanor had developed their own relationship, the older woman taking genuine interest in the girl's education and development. Watching them communicate, two deaf people across 7 decades of age difference, filled Marcus with a warmth he had not expected to feel again. Tonight, Eleanor had prepared something special. The table was set with care candles, casting soft light across dishes that looked restaurant quality. Maya's eyes widened as she took in the spread. This is all for us. This is to celebrate. Eleanor signed with the particular emphasis she used for important occasions. Good news deserves good food. They ate together, conversation flowing between signs and the occasional written note when terminology became too specialized. Maya asked questions about Eleanor's company, about how she had built it, about what it felt like to be a deaf woman in business when there were so few role models to follow. Lonely. Eleanor's answer was honest. I spent most of my career being the only deaf person in any room. People either treated me like an inspiration or a burden, never just a colleague. What changed? Nothing changed externally. I changed internally. I stopped waiting for the world to accommodate me and started demanding that it do so. I stopped apologizing for needing things and started insisting that my needs were as valid as anyone else's. Maya absorbed this with the particular intensity she brought to information she considered important. I want to be like you when I grow up. Eleanor's expression softened. I want you to be better. I want you to live in a world where being deaf doesn't mean fighting every day for basic respect. We haven't built that world yet, but we're working on it. After dinner, Eleanor produced a wrapped package and handed it to Maya. This is for you, for getting that honorable mention, and for being brave enough to start at a new school in a new city. Maya opened the gift with careful excitement. Inside was a tablet, computer top of the line loaded with educational apps and accessibility features designed specifically for deaf users. This is too much. Maya's signs were uncertain. This is exactly enough. Eleanor's response was firm. Education is the most powerful tool you'll ever have. This is an investment in your future. I expect significant returns. Maya threw her arms around Eleanor, a hug that communicated gratitude beyond what any language could express. Marcus watched, feeling the moment settle into the collection of memories he would carry forward, the good ones that balanced against the losses, the evidence that life could still offer unexpected gifts. Later, after Maya had fallen asleep in the guest room Eleanor maintained for exactly these occasions, Marcus and Eleanor sat by the window in their customary chairs. The city glittered below them, millions of lives unfolding in patterns they would never see. Thank you. Marcus signed the words simply. For everything you've done for us. I've done what made sense. For my company, for myself, for people I care about. Eleanor paused. The indictment came through today. I saw. Bradford will go to prison, so will the others. The 73 employees are being contacted about potential compensation. The system is actually working for once. It worked because someone pushed it to work. Several someones. Eleanor's smile was tired but genuine. We make a good team, Marcus Cole. We do. The silence that followed was comfortable, the kind that exists between people who have moved beyond the need to fill every moment with communication. Marcus felt the weight of the day settling around him. The science fair, the celebration, the profound gratitude for a life that had somehow rebuilt itself from ashes. I need to tell you something. Eleanor's signs were hesitant in a way Marcus had rarely seen. About Richard. About the progress he's making. His ASL is improving. Dramatically. He spends hours every day practicing. But it's more than that. He's changed. The exposure to what Bradford was doing, the realization that his willful ignorance had enabled fraud and discrimination, it broke something open in him. That's good. It is, but it also complicates things. Eleanor looked at Marcus directly. He's asked about the future, about the company, about what role he might play now that things are different. Marcus understood the subtext. Richard was Eleanor's son, her biological heir, the person who had the strongest claim to eventually lead Blackwood Enterprises. Whatever role Marcus had assumed during the crisis, Richard's rehabilitation threatened to displace it. What do you want to happen? I want my son to be someone I can trust with my life's work. And for the first time, I'm starting to believe that might be possible. Eleanor's hands moved slowly. But I also want you to know that whatever happens with Richard, your place in this company and in my life is secure. You're not a temporary solution to a problem. You're part of the foundation I'm building for whatever comes next. That matters. Marcus felt the truth of the statement, more than I expected it to. Good. Eleanor reached for his hand, the gesture becoming familiar between them. Because I'm not interested in temporary anymore. I've spent enough of my life managing temporary arrangements and waiting for the next crisis. I want something permanent, something real. So do I. They sat together as the night deepened, two people who had found their way to each other through circumstance and choice, building something neither had anticipated, but both had needed. The city hummed below them, indifferent to their small human moment, but the moment mattered anyway. Maya slept peacefully in the next room, her future stretching before her like a path through terrain that would be challenging but navigable. The FBI case moved forward, justice grinding toward its inevitable conclusion. Richard Blackwood learned the language of his mother, rebuilding a relationship damaged by decades of avoidance. And Marcus Cole, 58 years old and finally done with being invisible, allowed himself to imagine what the next chapter of his life might hold. The work was far from finished. Testimony lay ahead, and legal complications, and the ordinary difficulties of raising a child in a world not designed for her. But none of that could diminish the fundamental truth Marcus had discovered in the wreckage of Bradford Sterling's empire, that some victories were measured not in courtrooms or balance sheets, but in the simple, profound reality of being known and knowing in return. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan had seen its share of corporate fraud cases, but the prosecution of Bradford Sterling drew crowds that spilled beyond the gallery into the corridors. Marcus sat in the witness box on a Tuesday morning in late October, his hand raised for an oath he had taken dozens of times in his former life, though never with this much at stake. The prosecutor was a woman named Jennifer Chang, 43, and sharp as broken glass, who had built her career dismantling exactly the kind of empire Bradford had tried to construct from Eleanor's life's work. Marcus answered her questions with the precision he had learned during 30 years of interpretation. Yes, he had witnessed the board meetings. Yes, he had observed Bradford Sterling deliberately mistranslating Eleanor Blackwood's communications. Yes, he had documentation, emails, meeting minutes, recordings from the security system that Bradford had not known existed on the executive floors. The evidence formed a pattern so clear that even Bradford's expensive legal team could not obscure it. Eleanor testified the next day, and Marcus sat in the gallery, watching her hands move with absolute clarity as a certified interpreter translated for the court. She described years of watching her own words twisted her intentions, misrepresented her authority, systematically undermined by men who assumed her deafness meant diminished capacity. The judge, a woman in her 60s who had spent 4 decades on the bench, watched Eleanor's testimony with an expression that suggested she understood exactly what battles had been fought in those boardrooms. Bradford's defense rested on the argument that Richard Blackwood had been the primary interpreter, that any miscommunication resulted from family dynamics rather than criminal intent. The strategy collapsed when Richard took the stand for the prosecution. His testimony lasted 6 hours, and Marcus watched the jury's faces shift from skepticism to certainty as Eleanor's son detailed every instance where Bradford had coached him, corrected him, steered him toward translations that served Sterling's agenda rather than Eleanor's actual words. The guilty verdict came on a Friday afternoon 3 weeks later. Bradford Sterling stood motionless as the foreman read the counts: securities fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, and Marcus felt something settle in his chest that was not quite satisfaction, but closer to exhausted relief. Justice moved slowly, but occasionally it moved in the right direction. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Eleanor and her legal team. Marcus stayed back, comfortable again in his role as observer rather than participant. Then Eleanor's hand reached out, found his arm, and pulled him into the frame. The cameras caught the moment Marcus Cole, the security guard, who had blown the case wide open, standing beside the woman whose empire he had helped save. The photograph would run in the Times the next morning, and Marcus's phone would ring for days with interview requests he had no intention of accepting. That night, Eleanor hosted a small gathering at her penthouse. Richard was there. His signing noticeably improved his presence, still awkward, but no longer toxic. Dr. Catherine Wilson came along with 3 other board members who had stood with Eleanor when everything unraveled. Maya sat in the corner working on homework, occasionally looking up to watch the adults celebrate with the detached interest of a child who understood that something important had happened, but could not quite grasp its full weight. Marcus found himself on the balcony around 10, needing air and space from the congratulations that felt premature. The work was not finished. Bradford would appeal, and the civil suits would drag on for years, and the damage to Blackwood Enterprises' reputation required rebuilding that would outlast everyone in that room. Victory, such as it was, came with asterisks and footnotes. Eleanor joined him after a few minutes, her champagne glass untouched. Her hands moved in the dim light filtering from inside. "You're thinking too much." Marcus smiled despite himself. "Occupational hazard. Richard wants to talk to you. Tomorrow, if you are willing." Something in her expression warned Marcus that this conversation would not be simple. About what? The future. His future. Our future. Eleanor's signs slowed each word chosen with visible care. "He's been working with a therapist, doing the work to understand how he enabled Bradford, how his avoidance damaged our relationship. He wants to make amends, but he also wants to find his place in the company again." Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him, subtle but unmistakable. "And you want that too." "I want my son to be someone I can trust. I want him to have the chance to prove he's capable of growth." Eleanor paused, her hand still. "But I also made you promises, Marcus, about your place in this company, about permanence and security. Those promises stand. Even if Richard's redemption arc requires my exit, it doesn't require anything of the sort." Eleanor's signs became emphatic. "This isn't a zero-sum game. There's room for both of you, but I need you to meet with him tomorrow and hear what he has to say. Not as my employee, but as someone whose opinion I value." Marcus nodded, though uncertainty coiled in his stomach. He had seen too many redemption narratives collapse under the weight of old patterns, too many people who wanted to change without doing the actual work required. Richard Blackwood had been complicit in Bradford's scheme through willful ignorance, and ignorance, even when weaponized, left room for plausible deniability that Marcus did not trust. The meeting happened the next morning at a coffee shop in Midtown neutral territory that belonged to neither of them. Richard arrived early, already seated, when Marcus walked in, and the younger man's nervousness was visible in the way his hands moved restlessly across the table's surface. Marcus ordered coffee and sat down waiting. Richard had requested this meeting. Let him start it. "Thank you for coming." Richard's signs were slower than Eleanor's, still marked by the hesitation of someone translating from English rather than thinking directly in Excel. "I know you have no reason to trust me." "I don't." The bluntness seemed to steady Richard rather than offend him. "Good. You shouldn't. I spent years being exactly the kind of son who deserved your suspicion." He paused, fingers forming words and then dissolving them before settling on what he actually needed to say. My mother built something extraordinary, and I let Bradford Sterling nearly destroy it because I was too lazy and too proud to learn her language. That's not forgivable, but I'm trying to understand it anyway. Marcus sipped his coffee and waited. Apologies were easy. Action mattered more. I've been meeting with the board's diversity committee. They're developing new policies around accessibility, around accommodations for employees with disabilities. They want my input because I am Eleanor's son, but I've told them I'm the wrong person to ask. You're not. This was unexpected. Marcus set down his cup. What are you suggesting? The company needs a chief accessibility officer. Someone who understands both the legal requirements and the human reality of making a workplace truly inclusive. Someone who can develop policies, train staff, and ensure that what happened to my mother never happens to anyone else in our organization. Richard's hands moved with increasing confidence. The board voted unanimously to create the position. They want you. Marcus felt the offer land like a physical blow. Chief Accessibility Officer, executive-level position, salary that would make Maya's future secure benefits, that would cover Patricia's medical bills, authority to actually change how a major corporation treated its most vulnerable employees. Why? The question came out harsher than Marcus intended. Why now? Why me? Because you're qualified? Because you've earned it? Because my mother trusts you in a way she hasn't trusted anyone in years, and that trust means something. Richard paused. And because I need you there, I'm coming back to the company, but not in the role Bradford wanted for me. I'm starting over, learning the business from the ground up, proving I can be worthy of eventual leadership. But I can't do that without accountability. I need someone in that building who will call me out when I'm wrong, who won't let me slide back into old patterns. You're that person. Marcus studied Richard's face, looking for the deception that had to be buried somewhere in this offer. But all he saw was exhaustion and determination, expression of someone who had looked at himself honestly and found the view unpleasant. I'll need guarantees, in writing, about authority, about resources, about the ability to make real changes without board interference. Already drafted. Eleanor's lawyers have it ready for your review. And if I say no, Richard's smile was sad, then you say no, and we respect that. But I hope you won't, not just because the company needs you, but because Maya needs to see that the world can change. That deaf people can hold positions of real power, not just token representation. You'd be giving her something to aim for. The meeting lasted another hour, Richard answering Marcus's questions with a frankness that was either genuine or expertly performed. By the time they parted ways, Marcus had agreed to review the contract, but made no promises beyond that. He walked back to the subway, feeling the weight of decisions he had not expected to face, paths opening that he had assumed were closed forever. That evening, Marcus sat with Maya in Eleanor's study while the girl worked on a project about deaf inventors for her social studies class. She had been researching for weeks, filling notebooks with information about people who had created cochlear implants, developed sign language, pioneered accessibility technology. The project was due Monday, and Maya approached it with the intensity she brought to everything that mattered. Marcus watched her hands move as she signed to herself, working through the presentation she would give to her class. The confidence in her movements reminded him of Eleanor, that same refusal to let deafness be treated as limitation rather than difference. Maya would grow up in a world still hostile to people like her, but she would also grow up with tools and role models that Marcus's generation had never possessed. Eleanor entered the study around 8, carrying contracts that Marcus recognized immediately. She set them on the desk without ceremony, then settled into the chair across from him. Richard told you about the offer. He did. What do you think? Marcus looked at the contracts, thick with legal language, that would bind him to Blackwood Enterprises in ways that went far beyond night shift security patrols. I think it's dangerous to believe people change as quickly as Richard claims to have changed. Agreed. Which is why the position reports directly to me, not to him. Which is why your authority is enshrined in the corporate charter, not dependent on Richard's goodwill. Which is why I'm asking you to take this job, because I need someone I trust watching him as much as he claims to need accountability. That's not exactly a ringing endorsement of his redemption. No, it's not. But redemption isn't something you grant someone. It's something they earn through sustained action over time. Richard gets the chance to prove himself. You get the resources to build something lasting. I get to sleep at night knowing that at least one person in my company will tell me the truth no matter how inconvenient. Eleanor's hands moved with precision. Win, 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 as Bradford would have said, though I prefer to think of it as mutual benefit rather than victory. Marcus picked up the contract, flipping through pages that promised more money than he had earned in the best years of his interpreting career. The responsibilities were enormous: developing accessibility policies, training programs, compliance systems, advocacy initiatives. It was the kind of position that could consume a person's entire life, the kind of work that would demand everything he had to give. I'll need to talk to Patricia about Maya, about long-term care arrangements. This would mean committing to New York, permanently selling the Cleveland house, uprooting everything that's left of the life I built. I know. That's why I need your answer by next Friday, not tonight. These aren't decisions to make quickly. Eleanor paused, her expression softening. But Marcus, for what it's worth, you've already uprooted everything. The question isn't whether you can do it. The question is whether you're ready to admit that this is already your life. Now, not some temporary arrangement you're enduring until something better comes along. The words hit harder than Marcus expected. He thought about the Cleveland house he had not visited in 4 months, the possessions gathering dust in rooms that no longer held anything except memories of people who were gone. He thought about Patricia's last phone call, her careful suggestion that Maya needed stability more than she needed to wait for circumstances to align perfectly. He thought about the way Maya had begun signing home when referring to Eleanor's penthouse, the casual assumption that this was where they belonged. Eleanor was right. The life Marcus had been protecting was already gone. The question was whether he had the courage to fully inhabit the one that had replaced it. The board meeting happened on a Wednesday morning 2 weeks later, and Marcus Cole walked into that 42nd floor conference room wearing a suit that Eleanor's tailor had made specifically for this occasion. The 12 directors who had witnessed his first intervention now watched him take a seat at the table rather than standing in the shadows. Dr. Catherine Wilson smiled with genuine warmth. Margaret Foster nodded acknowledgement. Richard Blackwood sat at the far end, his hands folded in front of him, his expression carefully neutral. Eleanor Blackwood called the meeting to order with 3 sharp raps of her gavel, and her hands moved with absolute authority as she outlined the proposal before them. The creation of a chief accessibility officer position, the appointment of Marcus Cole to that role, the budget allocation required to implement real change rather than performative compliance. The presentation lasted 20 minutes, and when it finished, Eleanor opened the floor to questions. The questions came probing and practical, and Marcus answered them directly. He outlined his vision for accessibility training that went beyond legal minimums for hiring practices that actively recruited, rather than reluctantly accommodated for physical infrastructure changes that would make the building genuinely welcoming to employees with diverse needs. He spoke about the business case, talent retention, innovation, market expansion into communities that had been historically underserved. He spoke about the moral case too, though he knew that in this room, profit mattered more than principle. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive. 9 in favor, 3 abstentions, none opposed. Marcus Cole became the first chief accessibility officer in Blackwood Enterprises history, and Eleanor Blackwood smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had just moved another piece into place on a board only she could fully see. Afterward, Richard approached Marcus in the hallway outside the boardroom. The younger man's hands moved with careful deliberation. Congratulations, you'll be excellent at this. I'll be held accountable if I'm not. By me among others. Richard's expression was serious. I meant what I said about needing that accountability. I've started therapy, I'm learning ASL, and I'm doing the work. But I know how easy it would be to slip back into old patterns. So I'm asking you, don't let me. If you see me falling back into the person I was, tell me. Loudly if necessary. Marcus studied Richard's face, looking for the sincerity behind the words. And if telling you isn't enough, then you report it to my mother, to the board, to whoever needs to know. I'm done with the version of myself who valued comfort over integrity. That person nearly destroyed everything my mother built. I won't become him again. It was not a promise Marcus could verify, only one he could choose to believe or reject. He opted for cautious acceptance, the kind that left room for adjustment if circumstances changed. Then I'll hold you to that. And Richard, I'm not interested in friendship or alliance. I'm interested in making sure this company actually lives up to the ideals Eleanor fought to establish. If that means we work together, fine. If it means I oppose you, I'll do that too. I wouldn't expect anything else. Richard extended his hand, then seemed to remember that Marcus's hands were busy and shifted to a respectful nod instead. My mother chose well when she trusted you. I'm trying to be worthy of making the same choice. The months that followed were marked by the kind of unglamorous work that actually changed institutions. Marcus hired a team of specialists, ASL interpreters, disability rights, advocates, accessibility, consultants, and together they audited every policy, every practice, every assumption that Blackwood Enterprises had made about who belonged in its workforce. They found problems in hiring practices and promotion criteria, in the physical layout of buildings designed without consideration for anyone who navigated the world differently. They found resistance, too, from managers who saw accommodation as burden, and from employees who could not imagine why resources should be allocated to people they still unconsciously classified as other. But they found allies as well. Dr. Catherine Wilson championed the initiatives in board meetings. Department heads who had witnessed Eleanor's treatment recognized the importance of systemic change. And Eleanor herself threw the full weight of her authority behind every recommendation Marcus made, turning suggestions into mandates with the stroke of her pen. Maya thrived in her new school, her confidence growing as she discovered classmates who signed fluently and teachers who understood that deafness shaped experience without limiting potential. She joined the debate team, the robotics club, the student council. Marcus watched her bloom into the person she had always been capable of becoming, given the right environment and support. Patricia's health stabilized the stress of solo caregiving, lifted by Marcus's ability to provide both financial support and active presence in Maya's life. She visited New York once a month, staying in the guest room Eleanor maintained, and the 3 generations of their fractured family found ways to knit themselves back together around meals and museums and the ordinary rhythms of a life that had survived its breaking points. Richard Blackwood kept his promises mostly. He learned ASL with dedication that bordered on obsession, practicing until his hands moved with something approaching fluency. He worked his way through the company from the ground up, taking entry-level positions in different departments, learning the business his mother had built from perspectives he had never bothered to consider. When he failed, and he did fail occasionally, slipping into old patterns of assumption and privilege, he accepted correction with visible effort toward improvement rather than defensive justification. Marcus watched Richard's transformation with the skepticism of someone who had seen too many people claim growth without demonstrating change. But he also watched Eleanor's hope rekindled as her son slowly became someone she could imagine trusting with her legacy. It was not forgiveness exactly, and it was certainly not forgetting. But it was possibility, and in the wreckage of what Bradford Sterling had tried to destroy, possibility felt like its own kind of victory. The 1-year anniversary of Bradford's conviction fell on a Friday in October, and Eleanor marked it with a company-wide announcement about new accessibility initiatives that would serve as the Sterling Memorial Fund's opposite, a commitment to building rather than destroying, to inclusion rather than exploitation. Marcus stood beside her as she signed the announcement to a room full of employees who had learned at least basic ASL as part of the mandatory training his department had implemented. The applause that followed was not universal, but it was genuine, and Marcus allowed himself to believe that change, however slow, was actually taking root. That evening, Eleanor hosted dinner at the penthouse, just Marcus, Maya, and Richard. The meal was simple, the conversation easier than it had been months earlier, though still marked by the careful navigation of people learning to exist in the same space without the buffer of professional distance. Maya asked Richard about his progress through the company, her questions direct, in the way only children manage without giving offense. Richard answered honestly about failures and small successes, about how much he still had to learn, about his growing understanding of how privilege had blinded him to realities his mother faced daily. Eleanor listened to the exchange with an expression Marcus had learned to read as carefully controlled hope. She wanted to believe in Richard's transformation, wanted to imagine a future where her son could carry forward the work she had started. But she had been burned too many times to trust easily, and even genuine growth did not erase the years of damage that preceded it. After dinner, Richard excused himself early, citing an early morning commitment. Maya retreated to her room to video chat with friends from Cleveland, who remained important despite the distance. Marcus and Eleanor sat in their customary positions by the window, the city spreading below them in patterns of light that shifted with each passing year, but never fundamentally changed. Eleanor's hands moved in the dimness, forming words with the precision that came from 7 decades of making herself understood, despite every obstacle the world placed in her path. You've built something remarkable here, Marcus. The accessibility program, the cultural shift, the proof that a major corporation can actually prioritize inclusion without sacrificing profit. It will outlast both of us. We built it. You gave me the authority and resources. I just implemented what should have been standard practice all along. Don't diminish what you've accomplished. Most people talk about change. You actually made it happen. Eleanor paused, her expression thoughtful. I've been thinking about succession planning, about what happens to this company when I'm no longer capable of running it. Marcus felt the conversation shift into territory that demanded absolute honesty. You're thinking about Richard. I'm thinking about the future. Richard is part of that calculation, but not the only part. Eleanor's hands moved slowly, each sign weighted with consideration. I need to know that when I step down, or when circumstances force me to step down, this company will continue to honor the principles I've tried to establish. That means distributed leadership checks and balances people in key positions who will resist the kind of corruption Bradford represented. You want me to stay? I want you to promise me that whatever Richard becomes, whatever role he eventually plays, you'll remain as the conscience this company needs. Not as opposition, but as accountability. As the person who remembers what we fought for and won't let us slide back into comfortable complicity. It was the kind of promise that bound a person to something larger than themselves, the kind of commitment that transformed a job into a calling. Marcus thought about the Cleveland house he had finally sold 3 months earlier, about the life he had released in order to fully inhabit this one. He thought about Maya's future, about the possibility that she would grow up in a world slightly less hostile than the one he had navigated. He thought about Eleanor's fierce determination to build something that lasted beyond her own mortality. I promise, as long as I'm capable, as long as it matters, I'll stay. And I'll make sure that what you built doesn't get dismantled by people who value profit over principle. Eleanor reached for his hand and Marcus took it, the gesture communicating what no language could fully express. Two people who had found each other through crisis and chosen to build something together, who had survived betrayal and loss and the ordinary indignities of existence in a world not designed for them, who had decided that survival was not enough and reached for transformation instead. The months blurred into years, and Marcus Cole discovered that sustainable change required patience he had not known he possessed. The accessibility initiatives expanded beyond Blackwood Enterprises' other corporations and reaching out for consultation, for training, for proof that inclusion could exist alongside profitability. Marcus built a team that eventually no longer required his constant oversight systems that functioned whether or not he was present to enforce them. Maya graduated high school with honors that included scholarship offers from universities that had recruited her not despite her deafness, but because of the perspective it brought to their programs. She chose Gallaudet, the decision feeling inevitable to everyone who knew her, and Marcus drove her to Washington, D.C. on a Sunday in August with boxes of belongings and a future stretching before her that looked nothing like the one he had feared during those dark months after David's death. Richard Blackwood earned his position through work that convinced even Marcus's skepticism. He became COO after 5 years of proving himself in roles that tested capability rather than rewarding birthright. And Eleanor watched her son step into leadership with eyes that saw both his potential and his limitations clearly. Eleanor herself stepped back from daily operations at 81, transitioning to chairman emeritus while maintaining authority over strategic direction and remaining the moral center around which the company oriented itself. Her health remained solid, her mind sharp, her hands still moving with precision that commanded attention whenever she chose to speak. Marcus celebrated his 65th birthday in the office that had become home, surrounded by a team that had transformed accessibility from compliance checkbox into genuine competitive advantage. The work was not finished, it would never be finished, not while human beings kept constructing systems that excluded anyone who deviated from assumed norms. But it was real and it mattered, and when Marcus looked at the trajectory of change his department had catalyzed, he allowed himself to acknowledge that some defeats could be transformed into victories, given enough time and stubborn refusal to accept that the world could not be better than it was. The photograph from Bradford Sterling's trial still hung in Marcus's office, not as trophy, but as reminder. Eleanor Blackwood standing beside the security guard who had refused to stay invisible, both of them looking toward a future they were still actively building. The woman who had turned deafness into strength and the man who had discovered that sometimes the greatest victories came not from what you preserved, but from what you had the courage to release and rebuild. Marcus Cole had lost a wife, a son, the career that had defined him for 3 decades, and the certainty that life followed predictable patterns. He had gained a granddaughter raised with tools for navigating a hostile world, a position that allowed him to actually change that world rather than simply surviving it, in the knowledge that invisibility was a choice rather than an inevitability. The trade was not equal, nothing could replace what he had lost, but it was sufficient, and in the space between what was and what could be, he had found something that looked remarkably like purpose. The city hummed below, indifferent and eternal, and Marcus Cole sat in his office on the 42nd floor of Blackwood Enterprises, hands moving through reports that would shape policies affecting thousands of employees, and allowed himself to believe that the work he did mattered not just for today, but for every tomorrow that built upon it, one decision at a time.